It started on a lonely highway just outside of a small, forgotten town. The kind of place where streetlights flicker and the silence carries a weight. For Sarah, a freelance photographer, the trip was supposed to be routine. Capture a few landscapes for a travel magazine and head home. She'd been driving for hours, and the clock on her dashboard blinked 2:13 a.m. The vast darkness swallowed the road ahead, interrupted only by the twin beams of her headlights. The radio emitted a low hum of static. Sarah noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. A man wearing a pale, outdated suit and a wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't move or signal for help, just stood unnaturally still. She slowed down, instinctively curious, but something in her gut told her to keep driving. As her car passed him, she dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The man was gone. Her pulse quickened, but she rationalized it as her imagination playing tricks in the dim light. However, a sinking dread settled in her chest. She reached for her phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The static on the radio grew louder, pulsating in and out like a heartbeat. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to lose its meaning on the empty road. Then she saw it again. The same man, standing farther ahead, this time in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching against the pavement. When the car stopped, the man was nowhere to be seen. Sarah sat frozen, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was fully awake now, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She hit the gas pedal, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and whatever she'd just seen. But the road seemed endless, twisting and stretching unnaturally. Landmarks she swore she'd passed hours ago reappeared, as if mocking her attempts to escape. Her fuel gauge was dropping, the needle edging closer to empty. And then the whispers began. Faint at first, like a breeze brushing through cracked windows, but they grew louder, surrounding her. A low, guttural sound joined the chorus, an unintelligible voice that seemed to echo from within the car itself. Sarah glanced at the passenger seat, and her heart nearly stopped. A reflection in the side mirror caught her eye. Someone, or something, was sitting beside her. She swerved instinctively, causing the car to skid to the side of the road. Her breath came in short gasps as she scrambled to unbuckle her seatbelt and get out. She stumbled into the night, the oppressive darkness now feeling like a suffocating force. The car's headlights dimmed and flickered before going out completely. For a moment there was silence, an eerie calm. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Sarah spun around, her eyes straining to see through the black void. Her flashlight, retrieved from her glove compartment, barely pierced the darkness. The beam shook as her trembling hands scanned the area. That's when she saw them. Not one, but dozens of figures, standing just at the edge of the light. Their faces were featureless, pale ovals, as if the details had been smoothed away. They moved in unison, advancing silently. Sarah turned and ran, her breath ragged, her legs burning. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. She thought she could hear laughter, low and mocking. But when she looked over her shoulder, the figures were still there, closer than before. In her panic, she stumbled into a ditch, the cold mud clinging to her clothes. The flashlight slipped from her hand and rolled away, leaving her in near total darkness. The whispers closed in, now clear as voices, calling her name. A cold hand brushed her shoulder. When Sarah woke, it was daylight. She was lying in her car, parked neatly on the side of the road. There was no sign of the figures or the man in the hat. Her phone buzzed. It had service again. Relieved, she started the engine and drove, eager to leave the nightmare behind. But as she reached for the radio, the static returned. This time, it wasn't random noise. It was her voice, whispering, "You'll never leave."
Story number 2.
It was a dare, plain and simple. Mallory had always been the skeptic of her group of friends, the one who laughed off ghost stories and rolled her eyes at tales of cursed places. That's why, on this particular night, her friends dared her to spend 1 hour in the abandoned house at the edge of town. The house was infamous. Locals called it the Blood House, though no one could agree on the origin of the name. Some said it was because the original owners vanished, leaving behind a scene so grisly, the details were buried by the authorities. Others whispered about strange figures seen moving past the boarded-up windows late at night. Mallory dismissed it all as nonsense. Ghosts weren't real, she told herself, and haunted houses were just dusty old buildings. She walked up the cracked stone steps with a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other. Her friends, giggling nervously, stayed in the car at the edge of the overgrown yard, promising to come get her if she didn't come out in 60 minutes. The front door groaned on its hinges as she pushed it open. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked under her boots as she stepped inside, sweeping her flashlight across the dim interior. The house was eerily intact, furniture draped in dusty sheets, old photographs hanging crookedly on the peeling walls. Mallory's flashlight caught one of the photos, and she paused. It was a family portrait. A man, a woman, and a little girl. Their smiles were wide but unnatural, their eyes too bright, too knowing. Shrugging off a shiver, Mallory decided to pass the time by exploring. She ventured into the kitchen, where dishes were still laid out on the table as if the family had simply gotten up mid-meal and never returned. A clock on the wall ticked faintly, though the hands hadn't moved in decades. A soft thud came from upstairs. Mallory froze. Her first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But then it came again, deliberate and heavy, like a footstep. She swallowed hard, debating whether to go investigate or call her friends and admit defeat. But her pride wouldn't let her. She climbed the stairs slowly, the wooden steps groaning under her weight. The second floor was colder, the air carrying a faint hum she couldn't place. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors on either side. One door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Mallory approached cautiously, her flashlight trembling in her grip. As she reached the door, it creaked open further, revealing a child's bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, with peeling stickers of stars and moons. A small bed sat in the corner, its sheets tangled and stained. A single toy, a porcelain doll with a cracked face, sat upright on the bed, staring directly at the door. Mallory's breath caught as the doll's head turned slightly to face her. Her rational mind screamed for an explanation. Maybe the floor had shifted, or the wind had moved it. But then she saw it, tiny handprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the bed to where she stood. The door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged as she yanked at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The hum in the air grew louder, morphing into whispers that swirled around her, overlapping and incomprehensible. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming until it barely lit the space around her. Then the doll spoke. Its voice was high and childish, yet hollow, as if it echoed from somewhere deep underground. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its cracked lips unmoving. The bed creaked as if something unseen was shifting its weight. Mallory stumbled backward, her back hitting the door. A shadow began to rise from the bed, tall and formless, its edges flickering like smoke. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and full of rage. Mallory pounded on the door, screaming for her friends. The shadow loomed over her, its presence suffocating. Just as the darkness engulfed her, the door flew open, and she fell backward into the hallway. Her friends stood there, their faces pale and terrified. They'd heard her screams and come running. But when they tried to help her up, she slapped their hands away, shouting incoherently about the doll, the shadow, and the whispers. They looked confused. One of them shone their flashlight into the room. It was empty. No doll, no bed, no handprints. Just an empty, dusty space. Mallory refused to go back in, and her friends didn't press her. They left the house, the clock on her phone reading exactly 60 minutes. But as they drove away, Mallory felt something cold in her pocket. She reached in and pulled out a small porcelain arm, cracked at the shoulder, its hand frozen mid-wave. She never spoke of that night again.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm came out of nowhere, blanketing the isolated mountain road in an impenetrable sheet of white. Jake had been driving for hours, desperate to reach the cabin he'd rented for a solo getaway, but now his GPS was failing, the signal lost somewhere in the howling wind. The headlights barely pierced the swirling snow, and the road seemed to disappear under the growing drifts. A sudden thud jolted the car. Jake slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He stepped out into the freezing night, his boots crunching on the snow. The wind cut through his jacket like a blade. There was nothing behind the car. No debris, no fallen tree, no sign of what he might have hit. He checked the undercarriage, but saw nothing unusual. With a deep breath, he climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the doors. That's when he noticed the footprints. They started from the side of the road and led directly to the back of his car. They weren't animal prints, they were human, barefoot, the toes distinct in the powdery snow. Jake's stomach churned. The nearest town was miles away, and in this weather, no one could survive out here without gear. He peered into the rearview mirror, but the storm obscured everything beyond the glass. A tapping sound interrupted his thoughts. It came from the window beside him. Jake turned his head sharply, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing there, just the endless white. But the tapping came again, soft and deliberate. This time it was at the back window. He didn't wait to find out what it was. Slamming the car into drive, he pressed the gas pedal, the tires spinning before catching on the icy road. His heart raced as he sped forward, the tapping fading into the storm. Minutes passed, and Jake tried to convince himself it was the wind or his imagination. But then he heard it, a low, guttural growl, vibrating from somewhere inside the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, and his blood ran cold. A figure was sitting in the back seat. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with deep, sunken eyes that seemed to burn with a faint red glow. Its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. The creature tilted its head, watching him with an almost childlike curiosity. Jake screamed, swerving the car wildly. The figure didn't move, its gaze locked on him as if studying his every reaction. Desperate, Jake hit the brakes and leapt out of the car, stumbling into the snow. He ran, his breath visible in frantic puffs, but the storm disoriented him. The road was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Behind him, the car's headlights flickered and went out. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the night. Jake turned, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The car was empty, its doors wide open, snow blowing into the interior. But the footprints were back, leading away from the car and disappearing into the darkness. He followed them, his mind racing between terror and desperation. They led to a small clearing where an old, dilapidated cabin stood, its windows glowing faintly with an eerie yellow light. Against every instinct, Jake approached. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a single room. A fire burned in the hearth, but the flames cast no warmth. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an old, leather-bound book. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself was alive and watching him. Against his better judgment, Jake stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. The whispers began, soft at first, then rising to a deafening cacophony. The pages of the book flipped on their own, stopping abruptly at a page with his name scrawled in black ink. Beneath it were words he couldn't understand, written in a language that seemed to crawl across the page like living shadows. Jake turned to run, but the creature from the car was standing in the corner, its grin wider now, impossibly so. Its skeletal fingers pointed to the book. "Read," it rasped, its voice a dry hiss that filled the room. Jake shook his head, backing away, but the whispers grew louder, pressing into his skull like nails. The creature stepped closer, its twisted form blocking the door. With no other choice, Jake picked up the book. The second his fingers touched the pages, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, the world went black. When rescuers found his car days later, it was abandoned, the driver's side door hanging open. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, only the faint smell of burning wood in the air. And in the back seat, sitting perfectly upright, was an old leather-bound book.
Story number 4.
Elena was a night owl, often staying up late to work on her graphic design projects. Her apartment, tucked away on the 7th floor of an old building, was usually silent by midnight. The neighbors rarely made noise, and the creaky pipes had become white noise over time. It was 2:46 a.m. when she first noticed it. A notification pinged on her laptop, a file transfer request. She frowned. Elena wasn't sharing any files, and her Wi-Fi network was password protected. She opened the notification. The file's name was strange. Don't.look.jpg. Try. Curiosity got the better of her. Against her better judgment, she clicked on it. The image was grainy, black and white, and appeared to be a photo of her living room taken from the corner near her ceiling. Elena's stomach dropped. She immediately turned to look over her shoulder, but the room was empty, exactly as it should be. She checked the windows. Locked. The door secured with a deadbolt. Trying to shake off the unease, she deleted the file and unplugged her router, thinking it might be some bizarre hacking attempt. She even ran a virus scan for good measure. When nothing came up, she convinced herself it was a prank or a weird glitch. But just as she was about to return to her work, another notification popped up. This time, the file name read, icecu.move. Her heart pounded as she clicked on it. The video was only a few seconds long, but it was enough to send her spiraling into terror. The footage showed her sitting at her desk, staring at her screen. But the angle was impossible, filmed from directly above her, as if someone were standing on the ceiling. Elena jumped out of her chair, her eyes darting to the ceiling. Nothing. No cameras, no vents, just the smooth, cracked plaster of her old apartment. She grabbed her phone and called the building's security guard. When he answered groggily, she explained that someone might have hacked into her apartment. He promised to come up and check, though his tone suggested he thought she was imagining things. As she waited, the room felt colder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stared at her laptop, daring it to ping again. It did. This time, the file name was Behind You'd MP3. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, trembling. She didn't want to open it, but she couldn't resist. The audio file began to play, a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing. It grew louder, closer, until it felt like the breath was right against her ear. "Turn around," a voice whispered. Elena screamed, spinning in her chair, but the room was empty. The security guard arrived moments later, his flashlight cutting through the apartment's shadows. He searched every corner, every closet, even the crawl space above the ceiling panels. Nothing was out of place. "You probably need some sleep," he said with a tired chuckle, leaving her with a sense of unease rather than comfort. Elena tried to go to bed, but every creak of the building made her flinch. She finally fell into a restless sleep around 4 a.m., only to wake up 2 hours later to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a text. The number was unknown, and the message was just a photo. Her heart stopped when she opened it. The image was of her bedroom, taken from the foot of her bed, showing her asleep. Frantic, she bolted out of bed, throwing on clothes and stuffing essentials into a bag. She didn't care where she went, as long as it was away from the apartment. As she fled into the morning light, her phone buzzed one last time. The message read, "You can't escape." Elena never went back to the apartment. She moved to a different city, changed her number, and even abandoned her social media accounts. But the files still found her, always anonymous, always impossibly close. And every time she opened them, the last thing she heard was the voice. "Turn around."
Story number 5.
It was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, and Hannah wished she hadn't stayed so late at the office. By the time she left, the streets were deserted, and the only sound was the occasional crunch of her boots on the icy pavement. She pulled her coat tighter, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the air. The shortcut through the park saved her at least 10 minutes. And, though it was poorly lit, she'd taken it dozens of times before. Tonight, however, the shadows seemed darker, heavier. The bare trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the black sky. Halfway through, she noticed something. A figure stood under one of the streetlights up ahead. Tall, thin, and still as a statue, it faced away from her, its silhouette distorted by the pale yellow glow. Hannah slowed her pace, her heart thudding in her chest. "Probably just a drunk," she muttered to herself, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up her spine. She kept walking, her boots echoing loudly in the stillness. As she approached, she realized something was off. The figure wasn't wearing a coat or a hat, just a dark suit that seemed too tight for its elongated frame. Its arms hung unnaturally long, the hands dangling near its knees. When she was about 20 feet away, the figure moved. It didn't turn or shift its stance. Instead, its head slowly tilted backward as though trying to look at her upside down. Hannah froze. The face staring at her was blank. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over bone. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The figure's head snapped back upright, and it began to move, glide, toward her. Its long arms swayed unnaturally, and its body seemed to flicker like an image on a faulty screen. Panic overtook her. She turned and ran, her boots slipping on the icy path. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it. A faint, shuffling sound that was somehow getting closer. Her apartment building was just a block away. She reached it, fumbling with her keys as her shaking hands betrayed her. The sound was right behind her now, accompanied by a low, humming noise that seemed to vibrate in her chest. The key finally slid into the lock, and she threw the door open, slamming it shut behind her. She bolted up the stairs to her third-floor apartment, her heart racing. Once inside, she double-locked the door and leaned against it, her lungs burning as she tried to catch her breath. The apartment was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The hum was gone, and for a moment she thought she was safe. But then she noticed the light. A faint yellow glow was coming from her bedroom. Hannah's stomach sank. She hadn't left any lights on. Slowly, she crept toward the room, her feet silent on the carpeted floor. The door was ajar, and the light spilled out like liquid gold, pooling in the hallway. She pushed the door open with trembling hands. The figure was there, standing in the middle of her room, its faceless head tilted slightly, as if watching her. Hannah screamed and slammed the door, backing away as fast as she could. The humming started again, louder this time, filling her head with static. She turned to run, but the figure was already there, blocking the front door. Its arms extended toward her, impossibly long and thin, the fingers curling like talons. The hum became deafening, drowning out her screams as the room went dark. When her neighbors finally reported the strange, high-pitched noise coming from her apartment the next morning, the police found the door locked from the inside. The place was empty. All that remained was a faint yellow glow in the bedroom, and on the window, written in frost, were 2 words, "Come back."
Story number 6.
Ryan loved working the night shift. The office was quiet, the phones rarely rang, and he could catch up on his tasks without interruptions. It was a small company with only a few employees, and after 10 p.m., he was the only one there. The building was old, with a dimly lit interior that always seemed colder at night. Still, Ryan liked the solitude. He'd set up his desk near the large windows overlooking the city and spent most of the night sipping coffee and listening to soft music through his headphones. But that night was different. It started with the elevators. Around midnight, Ryan heard the distinct ding of the elevator arriving on his floor. He glanced up, expecting to see a courier or maybe one of his coworkers who'd forgotten something. The doors slid open, but no one stepped out. Ryan frowned, pulling off his headphones. He stood and walked to the elevator, peering inside. Empty. He pressed the button to send it back down and returned to his desk, chalking it up to a glitch. An hour later, the elevator dinged again. This time, Ryan didn't move. He sat at his desk, watching the doors slide open. Again, there was nothing there. But as the doors started to close, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting across the floor, disappearing down the hall. His pulse quickened. The building's security system required a key card to access the upper floors after hours, and no one else had checked in. Grabbing his phone, he decided to do a quick sweep of the office. He walked the length of the hall, checking the meeting rooms and break areas. Everything was empty, just as it should be. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. As he turned to head back to his desk, he heard it, a faint whisper coming from the far end of the hall. Ryan froze. The sound was low, almost unintelligible, but he could make out a single word, "Help." Against his better judgment, he followed the sound. It led him to the server room, a small, windowless space filled with blinking lights and humming machinery. He opened the door expecting to find, what? A trapped coworker? A malfunctioning speaker? The room was empty. The whisper came again, louder now. "Help me." Ryan spun around, but the hallway was silent. His phone vibrated in his hand, startling him. He looked down to see a new notification, a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "Why did you leave me here?" Ryan's mouth went dry. He quickly typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly, "You forgot me." Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the office into brief darkness. When they came back on, the atmosphere felt heavier, like the air was thick with something unseen. Ryan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. His stomach flipped as he opened it. The image was of his desk taken from behind the chair. But he hadn't been there when the photo was taken. He turned and ran for the stairs, not daring to wait for the elevator. As he descended, the building seemed to grow colder, the shadows darker. He felt a presence behind him, a weight that pressed against his back like icy hands. When he reached the lobby, the security guard on duty gave him a puzzled look. "Late night?" the guard asked. Ryan nodded, his breath still coming in gasps. "Did anyone else come in tonight?" The guard frowned, shaking his head. "Just you." Ryan didn't stay to explain. He grabbed his coat and left, vowing never to work the night shift again. But the next day, when the office opened, his coworkers found something on his desk. A single post-it note, written in shaky handwriting. "You'll never leave." Ryan never came back, and no one could explain how his keycard was used to access the building the following night.
Story number 7.
It was 1:15 midnight when Sarah's phone buzzed on her nightstand. Groggy and half asleep, she reached for it, expecting a spam email or an accidental late-night text. Instead, it was a notification from her home security app. Motion detected, backyard camera. Her heart sank. She lived alone in a quiet suburb where the nights were still and silent. She opened the app, and the live feed from the backyard camera flickered to life. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The patio furniture, the overgrown lawn, the shadowy outline of the fence. But then, movement caught her eye. A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the camera's view, partially obscured by the tree line. It wasn't moving, but it was there. Sarah sat up in bed, her pulse quickening. She tapped the screen to zoom in, but the image only pixelated, making it impossible to make out any details. The figure seemed tall, lanky, and oddly proportioned, like its limbs were slightly too long for its body. She debated calling the police, but what would she say? "There's someone standing near my fence?" Instead, she turned on the backyard floodlights with the app. The bright light washed over the yard, illuminating every corner. The figure was gone. Relieved but still unnerved, Sarah double-checked all her locks and returned to bed. She told herself it was probably a shadow or an animal, maybe even her tired eyes playing tricks on her. But as she drifted off, her phone buzzed again. Motion detected. Backyard camera. This time, she didn't hesitate. She opened the app immediately, her hands trembling. The figure was back, closer now, standing directly in the middle of the yard. Her breath caught. Its head tilted upward as if it was staring directly at the camera, or through it. Suddenly, the camera feed cut to static. Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned on every light in the house, grabbed a kitchen knife, and locked herself in her bedroom. Her fingers shook as she called the police, stammering out her address and explaining the situation. The operator assured her that an officer would be dispatched immediately. Minutes passed like hours. Sarah sat on the floor, clutching the knife, her ears straining for any sound. Finally, she heard the wail of a siren, followed by a knock at the door. "Police!" a voice called. She rushed to the door and let them in, tears streaming down her face as she explained what had happened. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with her, trying to calm her down. When they returned, their expressions were grim. "There's no one out there," one of them said, "but you should take a look at this." He handed her his flashlight and led her to the backyard. The grass was wet with dew, and under the floodlights, Sarah could clearly see a trail of footprints leading from the fence to her back door. The prints were enormous, far larger than any human foot. "Stay inside tonight," the officer advised. "We'll have someone patrol the area." She nodded, too shaken to argue. The officers left, and Sarah locked every door and window again, checking them twice before retreating to her bedroom. She sat on the bed, staring at her phone, debating whether to check the camera feed again. After several minutes, curiosity won out. She opened the app. The live feed showed nothing unusual. The backyard was empty, the floodlights casting long shadows across the grass. Relieved, she was about to close the app when something caught her eye. In the top corner of the screen, just barely visible, was a reflection. The camera was mounted high on the wall, angled downward, so there shouldn't have been anything to reflect unless it was directly above it. Sarah's heart stopped. Whatever it wasn't on the ground anymore. It was on the roof. The camera feed cut to static again, and the last thing Sarah heard before her phone went dark was a loud, deliberate knock on her bedroom window.
Story number 8.
David was an avid collector of old books, particularly ones with strange or mysterious histories. He often frequented secondhand stores and estate sales, searching for hidden gems. One rainy afternoon, he stumbled across a shop he'd never seen before. The sign above the door simply read, "Curiosities." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. Shelves were crammed with oddities, antique dolls, tarnished jewelry, faded photographs. But David's attention was immediately drawn to a table in the corner. There lay a single book, its cover plain black, with no title or markings. Intrigued, he picked it up. The leather binding was cold to the touch, and the pages were a strange grayish yellow, almost brittle. When he flipped through, he noticed the text was handwritten in dark ink, the letters slightly smudged as though the writer had been in a hurry. "How much for this?" David asked the shopkeeper, an old man with a hunched back and cloudy eyes. The man hesitated, his gaze locking on the book. "That one's not for sale," David frowned. "It's just sitting out." "It's not just a book," the shopkeeper said, his voice low. "It's a door, and once you open it, you can't close it again." David smirked, assuming it was a sales tactic. "I'll give you $50, The shopkeeper sighed, his shoulders slumping. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. At home, David placed the book on his desk and began examining it more closely. The text wasn't in any language he recognized, and the handwriting grew messier as it progressed, the lines jagged and erratic. Near the back of the book, the writing stopped abruptly, replaced by a single chilling sentence scrawled across an entire page. You shouldn't have come this far. He stared at the words, a prickle of unease creeping up his spine. A sudden knock at the door startled him. It was strange. His house was at the end of a long driveway, far from any neighbors or passersby. He wasn't expecting anyone. David opened the door to find no one there. Rain poured down, pooling on the stone steps. Just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something. A single footprint, pressed into the mud near the threshold. It was large, almost animal-like, with clawed toes. He slammed the door and locked it, his pulse racing. Returning to his desk, he stared at the book. Against his better judgment, he opened it again, flipping back to the page with the warning. The sentence had changed. It's here. David's breath hitched. He closed the book, shoved it into a drawer, and turned on every light in the house. He spent the next few hours pacing, his ears straining for any sound. At midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock. David grabbed a flashlight and crept to the breaker box, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. As he passed the hallway mirror, he froze. Something was wrong. In the beam of his flashlight, his reflection stared back at him, but it didn't move when he did. The figure in the mirror smiled, its teeth unnaturally sharp. David stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. When he looked up again, the mirror was empty. He didn't sleep that night. The next day, David returned to the shop, desperate to rid himself of the cursed book. But when he arrived, the building was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. Clutching the book to his chest, he turned to leave. But a voice stopped him. You can't get rid of it now. He spun around, but no one was there. The voice came again, this time from inside his head. You're part of the story. That night, as he tried to burn the book, the pages wouldn't catch fire. Instead, they writhed in the flames, the ink bleeding into new words. The end is near. David never left his house again. A week later, a neighbor called the police, reporting strange noises coming from David's home. They found it empty, except for the book, lying open on his desk. The last page had one new sentence written in blood. Now it's your turn.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a quick overnight camping trip. Lily, her boyfriend Mark, and their friend Hannah had hiked into the dense forest earlier that afternoon, eager to escape the city and enjoy the quiet of nature. The campsite they picked was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines with a clear view of the stars. They set up their tents, started a fire, and spent the evening sharing ghost stories, laughing nervously at every snap of a twig in the darkness. By midnight, the fire had burned low, and Lily decided to call it a night. Mark and Hannah stayed up, finishing their drinks, while Lily retreated to her tent and zipped herself inside. The woods were silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. Lily drifted off quickly, but her sleep was uneasy. A sound woke her in the early hours of the morning. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay there, her ears straining, she realized it was a voice, a faint, high-pitched whisper. Lily, come outside. Her heart stopped. She sat up, clutching her sleeping bag. The voice came again, clearer this time. It sounded like Mark. Lily, it's me. Come out here. She unzipped the tent a fraction, peeking out. The campsite was dark, the fire reduced to embers. Mark's and Hannah's tents were closed, their silhouettes barely visible inside. Mark? She whispered. The voice didn't answer. Instead, there was a long, drawn-out scratching sound, like fingernails on fabric. It was coming from the far side of her tent. Terrified, Lily grabbed her flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise. The beam illuminated the thin wall of the tent, revealing a shadow. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The shadow didn't move, even as Lily's shaking hands caused the light to flicker. Suddenly, the voice came again, louder, sharper. Come out, Lily, she screamed, waking Mark and Hannah. Within seconds, they were outside her tent, flashlights in hand. What happened? Mark asked, his voice groggy but concerned. There's someone out there, Lily stammered, pointing toward the trees. Mark and Hannah exchanged uneasy glances but didn't question her. Together, they scanned the perimeter of the campsite. Nothing. Probably just an animal, Mark said, trying to sound reassuring, but Lily knew what she'd seen. The next day, they packed up early and started the hike back. The trail felt different in the daylight, less magical, more oppressive. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. As they walked, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she'd see the figure again. About halfway back, Mark stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" Everyone froze. At first, it was just silence. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps came from behind them, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be any of the groups. "Keep moving," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. They quickened their pace, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. Lily glanced back. A figure was standing on the trail about 50 feet away. It was the same thing she'd seen the night before, too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Run!" Mark shouted. They bolted, the weight of their backpacks slowing them down. The trail seemed endless, the trees blurring together as they sprinted. Finally, they reached the car. Mark fumbled with the keys, unlocking the doors as the footsteps closed in. They all piled in, slamming the doors shut. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, as Mark started the engine, something hit the back of the car. They screamed as a hand, elongated, skeletal, with claw-like fingers, smacked against the rear window. The figure's face pressed against the glass, pale and featureless, except for deep, hollow pits where its eyes should have been. The car lurched forward as Mark floored the gas, speeding down the gravel road. When they finally reached the highway, no one spoke. The figure was gone, but the memory of its eyeless face lingered in their minds. None of them ever returned to that forest. Years later, Lily came across a local legend while researching unexplained disappearances in the area. The stories all mention the same thing: a figure in the woods, watching, waiting, whispering your name.